I draw inspiration for my photography from many sources. Some of the biggest ones are masters of the medium like Bill Brandt or Michael Kena, but over time I found great influence beyond photography. And the art form that has changed the way I approach photography the most in the last few years is Sumi-e. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, the Japanese art of ink painting. Some of the most beautiful art pieces I've ever seen were created in this art form. I'll show you some of them, and hopefully by the end of this video you'll understand why it has been so influential on my work and why its simplicity and yet its depth has inspired me so much, and maybe it will do the same for you. It was years ago when I first stumbled upon the concept of ma, what we call negative space. In Japanese arts, though, that negative space, that empty space, holds as much importance, if not more, than the rest of the artwork. I was really speechless when I first saw this piece in the Wikipedia article about ma called Pine Tree's Screen by Hasegawa Tohaku. It was incredibly simple and yet so beautiful, so subtle and yet so profound. That painting opened my eyes at a time when I was just getting started with black and white photography, when I was just experimenting with it, because I saw a different way of capturing a landscape, one in which we don't fill the whole frame with as much detail as possible, but instead focus on just the essence, showing only the necessary. By looking at that painting, at that drawing, I understood the power of suggestion, the power of silence, the power of the empty space, of not telling the whole story. I think I was always drawn to something like this, but it wasn't until I saw this beautiful painting, until I saw it with my own eyes, until I studied it, not just the trees, but the panels and how they relate to each other, that something clicked in here, because all of a sudden I had a much clearer idea of what I wanted to accomplish with my art, with my photography. By the way, I've talked about Sumi-e for the first time almost a couple of years ago on my Patreon page in a live stream. My Patreon is the best way to support my work and to support what I do here. So if you like what you see here, you might find even more over there. And again, you are helping me a lot accomplish my dream. The goal of classical Western painting is to depict the world and its objects as realistically as possible. To achieve that goal, it has developed a precise structure of foreground, background, and central object, creating a three-dimensional perspective. This style of painting needs light, shadow, and most of all, color. Ink painting uses none of these aids. Even though it too depicts a view of the world, its goal is not to produce a realistic picture of it, but rather an expression of the perception a painter wants to convey. It is an attempt to capture, in condensed form, the essence of an object, a person, or a landscape as seen through the eyes of the painter. For that reason, suggestion plays a key role. Suggestion and simplification in a painting imply reality. As soon as I found out about Sumi-e, I felt like I needed to know as much as possible about this art form, so I grabbed a couple of books. The first one is this one, Japanese Ink Painting, The Art of Sumi-e by Naomi Okamoto, and the other one is a slightly bigger, thicker one, Sumi-e, The Art of Japanese Ink Painting. The titles are not very original. This one is by Shoso Sato, and it even comes with a DVD here in the back. I have not played it because I don't have a DVD player. They are both pretty good introductions to the art of Sumi-e. They get pretty deep into the technical aspects of the art, how to use the brush, how to paint leaves, grass, water, and all the paintings shown in the book are beautiful. And to some degree, all of those examples were the most useful thing for me because they dive really deep into the all the details that went into making that painting, that drawing, because as opposed to photography where we work with reality and we have to just extract what we want, the painters, even if they are ink painters start with a blank canvas and they can choose what to add and what not to add. They have more artistic freedom, and you know, they might choose to go in great detail with some elements of the frame and ignore some of them altogether. And these books are pretty good at explaining some of those decisions of how they affect the composition, the balance, the relationship between the elements in the frame. There is a very good example on this book. Let me find it. Here, I finally found it. This drawing is called Fury of the Pacific, and it's a beautiful depiction of a coastal tree in a windstorm or rainstorm by the ocean. So on the right side of the frame you have that tree, on the left you have the waves, and they capture that fury, that rage of the water because of the storm. But the author says here that there was something missing, something linking both elements in the frame, so they decided to paint a rock in the middle. Painting here means a very, very subtle representation of that rock. It is very, very subtle, and they believe that that rock bridges both elements and the whole thing works much better this way. That is just one of the many, many examples these books provide. It's a beautiful drawing. I hope you agree with me there. But before showing you more examples, let me read you a paragraph that gave me goosebumps when I first read it because it resonates so much with me. And it goes like this. The essential character of ink painting is quite possibly a foreign concept for Western artists, because you have to become one with the object in the painting. In Western paintings, you are not the flower. However, try to picture yourself painting outside. Sense the rays of the sun on your skin. Let your eyes gaze into the distance. This is a moment when you begin to become one with the flower, the tree, the mountain, or whatever you are painting or photographing. And this resonates so much with me because I had not read about this anywhere else, or at least not put in this way, but I have felt this way quite a few times actually. One that I remember vividly because it happened very recently was in the Isle of Skye in Scotland. I was driving when I saw a tree, you can see here in this photograph, on a tiny island in the middle of a lake, or sorry, a loch. It was a beautiful sight. It was very windy, very rainy, very cold, and the tree was there all by itself, alone, standing. And I started to imagine, you know, what it'd be like to be that tree, to live in that island. I even saw myself looking back at the road and looking back at the cars passing by, and I started to try to understand what the tree, should I say, feel like when it saw, you know, all those people just driving by. I mean, I'm not even sure how to explain it, but somehow I felt a little bit connected to that tree. Now, the final image is just okay. I'm not saying that that connection, that feeling, or whatever you want to call it, made that photograph any better, or that it informed my choices as a photographer, but I felt something for sure. And as I said, this was not the first time. It actually happens quite often to me. Sometimes I imagine what it would be like to be on the top of a snowy peak, but not by myself or me as a person, but what it would be like for a tree or for a rock, just there with no option to, you know, come down from the mountain, but just living there and seeing all the landscape around. How many other things that I encountered on my adventures. I mean, I don't know, I got those goosebumps reading that because the book put into words something that I had felt out there when I contemplate a beautiful scene, and that is on page 2, so I knew that this book was for me. So hopefully you understand a little bit better by now why I fell in love with the art of Sumi-e and why it has been so inspirational to me. Now I'm gonna share some of the things that I learned from the art and from these 2 books, from the examples that they provide, and how it has informed my photography. And I have to start with contrast, the importance of contrast. And here I'm not talking about the contrast slider to make the blacks darker and the whites brighter. It's the contrast in between the elements in a frame. It's not just the dance between dark and light, but between motion and stillness, like in a long exposure, contrasting the stillness of a rock against the motion of the clouds or the water. It's the contrast between softness and strength, like a beautiful, small, fragile tree against a menacing sky. It's also the contrast between emptiness and fullness. They complement each other and exist in harmony. This is the kind of contrast that I look for in my photography. Everything that isn't essential is left out. Look at this beautiful, almost ethereal painting. The water shows no ripples, the sky shows no clouds, and yet you know they are there. There are no individual trees, you can't see the details of the boat or the man, and yet you know exactly what you're looking at. This is not an abstract painting. Here the painter is using suggestion and simplification, and it is you who has to use your imagination to see whatever you want to see here. This is another example of Mount Fuji, how just a few brush strokes suggest the mountain, the existence of the mountain. That engagement of the viewer with their imagination is something that I try to create with my own photography as well. For this I use, well, black and white. The removal of colors is already a departure from reality. I also use long exposures to remove details from the water or the sky. I also crash the blacks to remove details from the shadows. The opposite, I blow up the highlights to hide details in the brighter parts of the frame. I add grain to add texture, but also to remove details, and many other things, like using diffusion filters to make everything a little bit less real. All of this with the goal of telling just the very essential part of the story and leaving everything else up to the viewer. We saw that most of the Sumi-e paintings lack detail in the sky and the water. That is because in traditional Sumi-e landscapes, the sky is usually not painted at all, and water has little to no detail as well. Those spaces work as negative spaces, as ma, to separate the main elements of the painting, the essence, instead of the very common tendency of filling the skies with the most dramatic clouds that actually compete in attention with the landscape itself. Something I really like about both of these books is that they include a lot of examples, a lot of drawings of Western landscape. So they can give us new ideas of how to capture the landscapes that are closer to us. I really believe in the power of immersing ourselves in masterpieces, of studying them, of looking at the work of masters to internalize their vocabulary, so we have the tools to express ourselves. The same way that a writer can express themselves better, the wider their vocabulary is, the wider our toolbox is, the better we'll be able to express ourselves, the better photographers we will be. That's why I love looking at these examples, because they give me those tools that I might need in my photography to express my very own ideas. Look, for example, at this drawing of this cabin. It's just absolutely beautiful. It has no details whatsoever on the side of the cabin or the front of the cabin. You don't see the texture of the wood. The trees in the background lack a lot of details as well. The mountains in the background. The snow has no details either. You can only see like a little path or footprints leading to the cabin, and yet this drawing tells you everything you need to know to feel something about it. There's a castle here, the town of Heidelberg. There's not much detail of the town, just a few houses by the shore of the river, a little bit of the bridge, and a little bit of the castle up the hill, a church in there. There's no details of the tree or the hill on the left. The mountains are basically just outlined, no details whatsoever either, and yet that's all you need to understand this drawing. Or look at this beautiful waterfall, how the contrast was created by darkening the rocks and the trees on the cliffs, and the beautiful lines of the trees leading towards the mountains, devoid of much detail. This is pretty different from your normal landscape photographs or paintings where everything has to be in focus with as much detail as possible. So as I said, looking and studying these and other Sumi-e drawings has added new ways for me to see the world, has added to my vocabulary, and now I'm able to use those tools to express myself a little bit better, because it is when we are proficient with the tools and the vocabulary of our medium that we can focus on on what matters the most. This is why I always argue that we should master our tools, our camera, our lenses, so they become second nature to us. So when we are out there taking photos, we focus on what matters, that is capturing what we want to capture and not get lost on the settings, or if the ISO is 100 or 400, if the aperture is f2.8 or f4. Sure, we still need to control some of those things and be aware of what they are, but most importantly, we need to focus on what's in front of the camera and not on the camera itself. Having an open and, most importantly, attentive mind will make a much bigger difference than a slightly change in the aperture or the shutter speed. And since we were talking about exposing ourselves to good art, to masterpieces, and absorbing all their vocabulary, the author of this book also encourages you to copy the work of the masters of the art form of Sumi-e, to try to replicate what they've done in the past. It was very common in the past to have art students to go into museums with their canvas and with their pencils and to try to recreate the pieces that were hanging on the wall, and that is not allowed anymore in most museums. This is a little bit harder, more challenging in photography, of course. It takes a little bit more effort, but I always encourage people, I always encourage myself as well, to visit locations where some of your favorite photographs were made and to try to make them yourself. Not so much so you have the same photo in your portfolio, but it's just to put yourself in the feet of the master photographer or whoever made that photograph, to see what they saw when they were there, when they stood in front of the subject that you are trying to capture, again, to see what they decided to add, what they decided to leave out, what the time of the day was that they chose to be there, the time of the year, the conditions, the light, everything. I've done this many times myself in the American West, visiting some locations Ansel Adams and others photographed. I tried to see the windmills in La Mancha the same way Michael Kena saw them, and more recently I tried to feel the same Bill Brandt felt when capturing the Kashmir River in southern England. I think that this practice has the potential to teach you a lot about photography. Another Japanese concept that Sumi-e relies on is the concept of wabi-sabi, or the acceptance of transience and imperfection. There's a painting in this book of a landscape in the moonlight, where the author explains that while a full moon is something beautiful to see, it's not especially poetic in its perfection, so they added a few drifting clouds across its face to make it more bucolically pleasing. It's an imperfect beauty. This is something that I try to do myself in the field with my photography. I always shoot wide open because that makes the photographs a little bit less sharp, less photographically realistic. I also do a lot of long exposure photography, which even in the best case, when there is no wind, the conditions are perfect and the tripod is perfectly stable, it's always going to be ever so slightly less sharp than a photograph taken at, I don't know, 1/4000th of a second or something like that. I don't mind shooting at relatively high ISOs, and again, in post I always add grain, I use gradients, I decrease the clarity of some parts of the photograph. I guess I try my best to make my photographs a little bit less technically perfect, if you will, and to give them a more organic feeling, a soul, if you will, a little bit of a personal touch. Any visual art can teach us a lot about composition, and Sumi-e is no different. Actually, I learned almost more about composition by looking at these drawings than by looking at other photographs. One concept that I found here is the triangular composition that you can see here. Take a look at this drawing, for example. The subject is all the way on the right side of the frame. This is something that I do in my images sometimes as well, and this not only applies to a single piece but one made of 3 different panels. That's a very common practice in Japanese art, and something that I might want to start doing with my photographs as well. In any way, I found this very inspiring and refreshing, and it goes well beyond the rule of thirds. As you might notice in these drawings, the trees are never painted in isolation just by themselves. The backgrounds are very clean, but they are never empty, and that is something that I always try to emphasize as well, to give some context to what we are showing. I think it's very important because it plays into the suggestive nature of this art. Sometimes you see very minimalistic images, so minimal that objects stand by themselves, and that can work wonderfully sometimes, but I find that some of those images lack that hinting, that suggestive part that a bit of context can give them. Another good example of this is this stunning drawing of a flowering branch. The painter composed this very carefully. You might notice the contrast between the dark branch and the brighter flowers. They do not overlap each other. It creates a very soft contrast. And notice the background. They could have left it out but chose to suggest a grassy field. Or is it? Well, I think that's all I had to say about the beautiful art of Sumi-e. You might have noticed the influence of something like this in my work before, but I hope you understand a little bit better now why I like it so much, why it inspires me so much. Every once in a while I look at Sumi-e drawings to re-inspire myself, sometimes before I go out, sometimes even when I'm out, because I'm having a hard time finding something, or I'm struggling with my photography, and looking at other masterpieces always helps. I hope the video was useful. I hope it opened your eyes to something slightly different, something new and fresh, and that it helps your photography as well. But of course, do not stop here. Do not just look at Sumi-e. Look at any kind of visual art or any art. And in that sense, I would love to hear from you what your inspirations for your photography are. Please leave them down below in the comments. I will love to read them. And that's all. Thank you so much for watching, and see you in the next one.